Secondly, we have 3 lectures by Professor Marcuzzo today, tomorrow, and day after. And so I hope you will, all of you will attend all the 3 lectures and benefit from her presence. Yeah, thank you. So I'll go bring her with me and welcome her and then over to you. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Afternoon, please be seated, be seated.
International students will come here,
Okay,
but the camera is there, so we
Okay,
can speak.
okay.
They can see you.
do you have a pointer or do I use that?
Yeah.
Or I can use it, all right,
Okay.
yeah, okay,
And this is the microphone.
okay. That's okay?
Yeah. Is it okay for you?
It's okay for me. What about, does everybody listen outside? Are they happy?
Yes, we can hear well online.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So on your behalf, I would like to welcome Professor Marcuzzo. I will let her speak about work and other things. I only want to say that we are very grateful to her for having accepted our request and for having taken the trouble to come all the way to Delhi to spend time with us and deliver these lectures. I wish both of you interaction and happy time. We have 3 lectures. Let's benefit from all of them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azim. Let me start by saying that I'm delighted to be here. India is one of my favorite countries. I've come here many times. First time 2008 and Genu, and I met many friends whom I still befriend. And so I'm delighted to be here. Just about myself, I was involved in the history of economic thought from the earlier on in my career, and I've been involved in trying to make the subject as known and recognized as possible. Presently, I am president of the History of Economic Society of the United States. Formerly, I was president of the European Society for the History of Economic Thought, and previously of the Italian Society for the History of Economic Thought. So I spent my life in trying to make the subject known and acceptable. So I hope that I will be able to persuade you, or rather more than persuade you, to make you interested in the subject. So my first lecture will be about history of economic thought. Okay. Oh, I'm not blocking anything. All right. Okay. So let me start by a very basic question. What is history of economic thought, and why should we bother with it? Okay. So you might have found in, reading and so on, that there might be different wording: history of economic thought, history of economics, history of political economy, and, basically that's the use is a wording thing. They are basically the same. What they are not the same is with economic history. Okay, so one should not confuse history of economic thought with economic history. What characterizes history of economic thought is obviously the historical, the broad context. What is a context? Is when you look at circumstances, you look at personalities, you look at networks, you look at background. In other words, ideas are not like clouds, they're up in the air. They are grounded in people's lives. And so to know how ideas originated, how they were developed and diffused becomes one of our concerns, okay? So there is obviously a relationship between economic history and history of economic thought. For instance, if you look at the Great Depression or you look at financial crisis, you know, you want to bring together the facts, what has happened in that particular time with the idea that developed at the time. And how ideas influence facts and how facts in turn influence idea. So there is some kind of linkage between the two, but we will be concerned mainly with ideas, okay? Placed in context. Okay? That's what we will be doing, okay? So once we have the definition, we want to understand how history of economic thought is done, how it is interpreted, and as in many other areas of economics, you have a mainstream approach, a non-mainstream approach. Even within the non-mainstream approach, you have different ways of doing history of economic thought, okay? So in mainstream approach, basically people who do history of economic thought, they just want to show the past errors as compared to the present truth, all right? So history of economic thought becomes a sort of game to show who's right, who's wrong, and the answer, what is it? The present economic theory is the right one. Jay-Z, sorry, can I ask to have the glass of water that I left over there? Thank you, thank you. On the other hand, history of economic thought, when it's done by heterodox economists, is becoming something to look in the past to see whether some ideas have been lost because the mainstream won. And so history of economic thought become digging into the past to see whether we have some ideas that, thank you very much. Sorry, because, okay, thanks. So my favorite slogan is that economics is not Darwinian. It's not like in Darwin theory that the best species, you know, evolve. Unfortunately, in economics, sometimes the best theory do not survive for very reasons. So one of the possibility in doing history of economic thought is to see whether there are ideas that were much better and somehow did not survive, and so it might be worth trying to recuperate them. Okay, so that's very broad distinction between doing history of economic thought from an heterodox perspective or doing it from a mainstream perspective. Sometimes in the mainstream, you know, they just add to sprinkle a little bit of history just to show, for instance, that, oh, it was Adam Smith who already said perfect competition, or it was Keynes who said something. So you just sprinkle a little bit of history of economic thought, but there's no serious engagement with the historical narrative, which it is what heterodox economists do, okay? So what is the historical approach, which is characterized doing history of economic thought? As I told you already, is to put idea in the context, okay? So if you put in the context, you have only to understand the meanings, and the meanings, of course, require that you engage with the text. You know, if you want to understand, say, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, even if you want to understand Shakespeare, Aristotle, or any great author, you have to engage with the text. And the text doesn't speak to you in the same way as it does if you read some contemporary author. So it's very important, if you want to become an historian of economic thought, that you are ready to engage with text. Sometimes archival work, because you want to understand the background, and maybe the background is not available, is not everything's published stuff. So if you like that kind of game, you go into archives, try to discover letters, try to discover things that would help you to give meaning to something that is not so immediate to you, because we're talking about the past. By the way, you can do history of economic thought also in author of 10 years ago. It doesn't have to be 200 years ago. It's the approach that makes the difference, not whether it is 18th century or or 19th century, okay? So, as I said, you need to, in order to be able to engage with the text, you have to be able to get into some background discovery, some historical research, just to place the text in its context. Now, history of economic thought can be done in very different ways, as I said, and just to give you an idea how the subject, even academically or professionally, developed, let me just give you a brief presentation of what I consider to be 4 ways in which history of economic thought is done. One, I call it textual exegesis. The other is rational reconstruction. The other is contextual analysis, and the fourth is historical narrative. They are not necessarily, mutually exclusive. People who does contextual analysis may be doing both rational reconstruction and historical narrative. So they are not mutually exclusive. That's for the sake of clarity that I use these categories. You should not take them as, something that have strict boundaries. So let me give you a sense of what is textual exegesis. Textual exegesis is when you engage with the idea that there is one true meaning of a text, okay? And as I said, especially in the mainstream analysis, the true meaning of the text is when you translate it in terms of contemporary knowledge. So if you read a text, you say, what is this author really saying? Is it right or is it wrong? On the basis of our understanding today, what is the right theory? Okay, so textual exegesis is when you give meaning to a text, and you can give a meaning to a text in a very different ways. Let me just give you an example. Suppose you are a movie director, okay, and you want to do a piece of theater, and you take a piece from Shakespeare, just to say a great author or some great novelist, and you can set up this piece in a way that dress people in contemporary clothes. This is done sometimes, you have, and just because you want to give the sense that this piece of work has relevance for today, and that's how you try to translate it into. On the other hand, you may be very much conscious that it's important to give the meaning of the basis of what we understand and what we knew of the past. By the way, we would never know perfectly well the past. You can imagine. But even, in doing that, we are limited by our knowledge. So when you give meaning to a text, you engage in a different sort of attitude. You can try to make it as close as possible to what we understand now, to be the sense of something, or you try to say, I don't want to be obsessed by making this look as if it were written today. I just want to give a sense on the basis of what was it at the time. And most of the people who did textual exegesis in the past were trying to make this translation business, translating the authors into today's understanding of the theory. Rational reconstruction is a different sort of similar but different type of exercise. It was done in the 80s and in the 90s. And the idea was, okay, I don't want to make it compatible with modern theory, but I have to make some kind of translation. Because the way in which this concepts were formulated was not so clear. For instance, translate something into a mathematical model just to make it clearer, okay? That's different from the other exercise. It's just saying, I want to make it in a formulation that allows me to be clearer about the meaning. But that doesn't necessarily imply that you want to translate it in modern economics. Just implies that you want to make a translation in a way that would allow you to get a clearer insight in the meaning. I don't know whether, oh, by the way, I didn't say this before, but I'm completely happy for you to interrupt me if you want me to, to clarify something, or we can do it at the end, but even, just raise your hand and say, can you repeat this because I didn't get it, or I'm happy with this, all right? So we're talking about the techniques, the meaning, translation, different ways in which you want to do that. What is the purpose of this exercise? So that gets up to the question why. Okay, so we have different techniques of engaging with the text, engaging with the past. You might want to do in one way or the other. The relevant question is, why should I be bothered? If I'm an economist, why would I do that rather than doing something else? One question, which is my answer, because that's what I did, and that's the reason why I became an historian of economic thought, because I was unhappy the way in which economics was done. I didn't believe that, modern economics would provide the answer I was looking for. And I thought maybe if I search in the past, in the great author of the past, I might find idea which I consider to be more interesting, more important than the one that are presented today. On the other, and this I call quest for an alternative. Okay, I do history of economic thought because I don't like modern economics, or I don't like all modern economics. I want to find some alternative. And I look into the past to see whether I might find ideas that, once developed, would provide an alternative to standard mainstream economics. Then there is another way, which is typical of, I think, of a different approach to history of economic thought, is to find predecessors. Okay, so for instance, assuming the idea of competition, or again monopolist, or the idea of financial stability. So you want to find out who was the first to solve these things. You want to find, I call it quest for ascendancy, to find predecessors, to find people who said these things first. And this is also might be an interesting exercise. Sometimes I don't like that particularly because you're forced into the past, what is already here. So you say, oh, you see, that's what he already said. But, I'm not sure that all the time is that. Sometimes it's useful, but sometimes there's a problem. What I prefer, rather than having all this translation, is what I call historical reconstruction. Historical reconstruction means that you engage with the idea of an author in a very complex way, trying to combine knowledge of the period, okay, knowledge of the person, knowledge of what was going on at the time. So you engage in a proper historical reconstruction. And this is sometimes very rewarding if you like that sort of game, If you like doing econometrics, that is not for you. If you like historical research, that's the kind of thing that you like to do, okay? I'm not saying anything bad about econometrics. I just say that you have a mind, that you look for model, data set, and so on. Well, that's not. But it is the same, you need the same, punctiliosity to try to, when you do historical research, one thing leads to another. It's a never-ending thing, because you discover a fact, then you think this fact is related to another fact, and then you change the other fact. Can be a non-ending game. So one has to be careful, okay? So it's like a puzzle-solving game, basically. You try to get to know this person, to know that circumstances, and some economists think this is just waste of time. Why do you spend time doing all these antiques? Why should you doing this? So we have to fight all the time to justify. I stopped justifying myself. I just enjoy doing it. I made a career out of it. I'm happy with it. But I can understand that for young people it might be challenging, you know, why are you bothering with all this? Why serious economics is facing contemporary problems and so forth. I hope to show you during this set of lectures that there is not just fun in doing this, but it has a useful purpose because it keeps your mind open rather than being bogged down in the kind of type of economics. Who would enjoy spend time on indifferent curves, budget constraint, and you know, ISLM? I mean, is that fun? I don't think so. So I gather that if you supplemented this, you need to know this stuff, but you need to supplement it in some mind-opening type of approach, which I hope history of economic thought would give you. Okay. So historical analysis, of course, requires that you're able to do context. Context means that when you discover something, you are able to put it in the right context. You should not put something in the wrong context, okay? And that's again require the ability to know the state of the art. My other example is that suppose that you have at home some artifact of the Mughal period, pottery or something. In order to restore that piece of things, you have to know a lot about the period. You have to know what the material were like. You have to know how the artisans worked and all that. And this requires a lot of contextualization of the type. And not everybody will able to do it, and not everybody should be employed in doing this, but there must be at least someone who's able to recover the past in the way in which the past things were done. And so historians of economic thought, in a sense, are like the archaeologists, are those who are able to recognize a piece of idea, to place in the context, to recognize why that particular author made that particular statement and so forth. And so we are able to recuperate that meaning and make the use of it that we believe is more appropriate, to compare with present idea, maybe to understand certain facts of the past because that ideas at the time were important and so forth. Okay, so that's what it's all about. So in this respect, archival work is important because not all information that you need in order to recuperate the past are available and published. So you have to do some archival research, to go in the places where you can find all the information. And this is something which has produced interesting analysis. And finally, what I call historical narrative. You just involve yourself in an analysis that is not just about the big names, but you just, as I said, you step down from the shoulder of the giant. You don't just work on Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Keynes, Marshall, all these big names. You might find people who are not so recognized, but they might be interesting for what they provide in terms of contents and so forth. And so that kind of activity is becoming quite important because we discover, for instance, now there is a trend in trying to discover work that's been done by women that were not recognized. There is a field now in gender history of economic thought in which you want to discover what they call hidden voices, people that were not, women that were not recognized, were not famous, but sometimes they are more interesting things to say that they are contemporary males. So you see, in doing this historical reconstruction, archival work, you might discover ideas and people that were not obviously known and recognized. Okay? And obviously, when you do that, it's important to keep in mind that you have to know very well the economic history of the period. You cannot ignore this thing. So finally, what is good history of economic thought? Everybody can write history of economic, not everybody. There are many people who write history of economic thought. Some are good, some are bad, as in economics. Not just doing history of economic thought is a good thing. You have to do it well, and you have to do it in a way that has some value. So what I just give you a list what I consider to be good history of economic thought. So use of primary sources, you have to do checking for evidence. It's like a mystery sometimes, find a clue. You have to have a good background knowledge. And this is something that most economists do not have these skills because they are trained to do something else, to do modeling, to do mathematics, to do that. So when they do this, sometimes they just apply like doing a model. This is not what is supposed to be doing. So that's what is required. So I think that if you are an historian of economic thought, you have to have these qualities. And unfortunately, within the economics profession, sometimes this work is not recognized, is not necessarily appreciated. But there are good news and bad news about the subject, okay? So let's start from the bad news. Decline of history of economic thought, especially in the US now. There are hardly any course in the history of economic thought considered to be a waste of time. A lot of maths, a lot of statistics, a lot of econometrics, a lot of this. No history of economic thought. Hardly any history of economic thought at the doctoral level are still in Europe. And I'm gathered that in India is not very different. But the good news now. The good news that there is an international history of economic community. I just give you the history, the society. They are thriving, like European society, history of economic society, Italian, now the South American and the Japanese. And now you have the Indian ones. I think next conference will be in October here in Delhi. I've already been asked to give the keynote lecture, so I hope to come back. So the good news is that there are these society that are, they are not big numbers, but, they are numbers sufficiently high to be encouraging for the subject. Okay, so that was the first slides. We have in 3 set of slides. I wonder whether is it better that we stop now to discuss this, or if you want me to go on, whatever. Okay, so how do I do that?
Hi, Prof.
Okay.
Yes, Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
It's Michael. It's Michael from Cairo, Egypt. Lovely to learn about you and your work.
Yes.
Just a bit of a background. I studied political science both as an undergrad and grad in Toronto, Canada. And my first exposure really to the history of economic thought was the lovely text by E.K. Hunt.
Yes.
But, as I grew, both professionally and personally, I've always been intrigued by this idea of arriving at a truth. So, first principle thinking, for instance. But, it seems been a slightly, I guess I can conclude, and obviously I'd love your perspective on this, is that it's very difficult to arrive at a truth in a sense. You can arrive at elements of truth. If you're taking the historical reconstructionist approach, because it does come down to questions of interpretations and biases and so on. And so it begs the question, what is true? What is the truth effectively? Can we arrive at elements of truth via all these different, thinkers?
Well, you see, historical truth is different from, say, mathematical or hard science truth, because as you said yourself, as you said, there is a matter of interpretation. What is the true interpretation of Gandhi thinking? Or Nehru, or no serious scholar would claim this is the truth. They would say, this is my interpretation, and this is the evidence I can provide you to support my interpretation. And then you are confronted with different interpretation, and you, on the basis of the scholarship of the author involved, then you decide who is more convincing to you or not. Of course, this is not just a matter of liking. It's a matter of serious, evaluation. But you have to remember that it's always a matter of interpretation. But this is not just in economics. This is, I give you an idea of Gandhi or Nehru. Just a friend of mine, former professor of Genio, Professor Aditya Mujarki, who just wrote the famous book on Nehru, it just came out. And it's been praised as a great book, but some people objected and say, no, this is not the right interpretation. So that's happened in all kind of historical interpretation, that to claim what is the truth they're always competing interpretation. And the question is whether this is scholarly done or it is done in a way that is unconvincing. I don't know whether I answer your question, but that's the best I can do.
It's very helpful. It's good to think about,
Okay. There is another, no, not at all. There is another hands raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Oh, basically I'm a PhD scholar and doing a PhD related to the field of political economy. That is basically the relationship between economy and democracy in this new liberal era of globalization. So I was doing same thing.
Can you speak a bit slowly, because there is a sound problem that I can't understand you properly. Perhaps you speak a bit slowly. Maybe we get the sound better. Can you try?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm doing my PhD in the field of political economics.
Yes.
So my work is with the relationship between the economy and democracy in this new liberal era of globalization.
Yes. What is your question?
No, my question is, I was following the same methodology of historical contextual analysis instead of the econometric and all these things. So I was looking at the classical economists, not kind of economists, classical theorists like John Locke and all others, and what they said, and now what the contemporary economists are translating them are quite different, as you said. So we should look at at their interpretation with the historical contextual perspective. That is one thing. And another thing, when you it's not question when you say
are you making a comment? Sorry, you're making a comment, right? You're not asking anything. Can we leave the comment at the end? Sorry, can we leave the comments at the end? Because I think it's more important now that we get to the question, clarifies and so on. But you're welcome to make comments, but I would leave the comment at the end, because I think it's better now to have questions that would help to clarify what I'm asking. And then you can keep your comment for the end. All right? Good. Thank you. All right. So is there any questions, clarifying and so forth? Now, the question is mine. How do I get to my next slide? Can you help me with this? Thank you. Okay, so Yuzim is coming. Oh, there's another question? Okay, Silvana, I hear.
Good afternoon, Professor. I do have a question related to the prevailing importance of maths. How did it happen? Why in faculties of economics there is this decline in having classes that explain the history of economic thought, and why and when did it become so important, the maths content? Because even in my own experience, I feel I have had very good professors of economics, but I think that sometimes they're like mathematicians, and sometimes in the
I know exactly what you mean. Well, there are different explanations which have been given of the reasons why. One has been that, let's take what I consider to be, an explanation that doesn't have any political implication. Explanation being that you want to make history of economics becoming more scientific, and scientific means more math, which is ridiculous, of course, because you can write a lot of rubbish in maths. rubbish in, rubbish out. It's not that because you put maths, it becomes something that is. But there was this idea that you want to make it more scientific, and scientific means. Then there was the internationalization things. You want to make a language that is understood by everybody. So if you translate ideas into math, they become more accessible and things like that. But there is another story which I consider to be also interesting. During the Cold War, when the Cold War ended officially, there was a lot of physician, mathematician out of jobs. Where do they go? They went to the economics department because they were hiring people because there was the computer development, so they need people and so on. So this influx, that's one story. I'm not saying that is the entire explanation, but certainly a sociological explanation of some importance, because the influx, even nowadays, if you want to make a career in economics, you're better off have a degree in engineering and mathematics. It is faster, okay? So that becomes obviously a loop that feeds itself up, becoming, if the best professor are mathematical trained, their students will require to have a lot of maths trainings and so forth. So it's becoming a loop. And then there is this idea that if you stay in mathematics, you stay away from any political issues. And also this is considered to be something that has been valuable. I don't know whether I answer your question, Silvana. There are many explanations. Some of them are more convincing than others, but certainly it is true that now we're getting a lot of maths, unnecessary math, and we get so little economic content that we really need. That's why I think history economic thought might help, because might introduce again ideas, again discussion on matters that are not just technical. Okay, is that all right?
Thank you very much.
Okay, good. So now let's get into as I promised, we are going to, oh, sorry, you wanted to ask something.
I just wanted to add something to what you're saying about, because also a question, like maths is also used to justify all kinds of things like inequality, trickle-down effect, failure of neoliberalism, right? Like, I've seen in some,
yeah, but it has to be true. So I've seen a lot of Marxists who become very fond of mathematics. It's not just, it is true that comes mainly from the mainstream, but it's only this fantasy that you put mathematics become scientific. Wording is chatting. No, it's not science, it's not rigorous. So that is done also in some, not as much as in the other, but so it's this fantasy that obviously mathematics can give you some clarity. I'm not denying this. And there are things that are better presented in mathematical terms if it helps to clarify. What I don't like when mathematics is used to obscure rather than to clarify, that's different matter. And that can be done from the right, from the left, okay, so let's get into the, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Similar questions, and maybe I'll play devil's
Can you
advocate.
speak up a little bit?
Yeah, so in one of your slides, in the beginning slides.
It's not on, the mic is not on.
Am I audible? I don't know.
Is it?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So one of your slides had mentioned that one of the main sort of pillars of the mainstream approach for HET is that there is a centrality of modeling and formalization, mathematical modeling and formalization, right? But so we've started off by sort of saying history of economic thought is about discussing ideas. And I feel like, in heterodox also, in heterodox macro political economy, we use math, we use formalizations actually in order to discuss ideas, right? So there's involvement of math in heterodox, but the ideas that we are trying to substantiate are quite different from what classicals, the neoclassicals or the mainstream are doing. So is it really that, there's a lot of centrality and obsession given to modeling that differentiates the mainstream approach of HCT to the heterodox?
No,
or is it?
no, absolutely no. Absolutely agree with you. Modeling is a strategy that is useful for certain purposes. If you want to test something, you need a modeling, whether you are mainstream or you're not mainstream, because again, it depends what you put in your model. What I dispute is the only way to understand a theory or to understand a problem is through modeling. For instance, if you want to understand some, as we will see, some of Keynes' ideas, I don't think that modeling is the best strategy. If you want to understand something going on in macro analysis, then maybe the modeling strategy is a good one. So it's not what differentiates mainstream from non-mainstream is not the modeling strategy, in which kind of idea goes into the model, but what differentiates history of economic thought from the modeling strategy is in order to understand ideas, you have a strategy to put them in the context in which you want to understand the meaning, and that you cannot do with modeling. Okay, I don't know whether I answer your question. Okay, shall we go on with the? Okay, so we want now to get into the subject matter. So we want to do history of economic thought properly. So we want to start from the classical theory. Let me give some names that might be useful to you to know. Petty, Kene, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and other less known figures that are considered to be classical economists, Cantillon, Hume, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. I gather that some of them are known to you, some are less known to you, but these are the really important economists in the classical period. Okay, so let's start from Kene. Did any of you ever heard of him, or this is the first time? First time? Okay. So it was a leading figure among this group of economists in the 18th century. They were called the physiocrats, which attributed a key role to the development of agriculture. And they were based in France, and France at the time was the most advanced country in terms of technology applied to agriculture. And so they discovered that agriculture was able to produce a surplus, and they attributed this to the nature of the land, rather than what we know now being caused by the fact that they have introduced a lot of technological improvement into the land. And so what they discover on the basis, as you can see, by knowing what were the historical condition at the time, we can recognize now why they attributed so much importance to the land by producing more output than the input, so producing a surplus. And they considered the land being the only productive sector of the economy because it was able to produce a surplus, namely to produce more of what you put into it. And that's, of course, was due to the fact that there was some technological improvement. And so Kene developed what is the first input-output analysis. It's called the tableau économique, in which he put together all the relationship intercurring between the agriculture, the industrial, and the so-called aristocracy and clergy. They were the one who just got the benefit of the rent out of this product. And so he was the first to see the economic system as in a system, in all the classes interacting to each other. And he developed this way of representing it, which is the first input-output model that we have. And so why is it interesting? Well, because we can see developing the idea that the economic system is ruled by classes, that the surplus goes to the rentier classes. And so it's the first, that's what characterized the classical approach, to understand the working of the economic system as a way embedded in the social relationship of the time, okay? And then, of course, the great classical author, I'm sure you've heard of him, Adam Smith. And perhaps what is not known by people doing just economics is that Adam Smith is very important for his philosophy. And for a book, it's called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he analyzed the motivation for human action. Here, we have the first example of why it's interesting to go back to all the. In economics, men are just doing one thing. They're maximizing something under constraint. They don't do anything else. It's not very, interesting because now we have all this experimental economics. We have all these things. We try to explain behavior by looking at other things rather than maximizing agents. But generally speaking, what we have is that in economics, human activity and human behavior is very poorly represented, And instead, Adam Smith, who is the founder of economics, of modern economics, instead had a much richer study of human motivation, And then he said, perhaps you know that Adam Smith is attributed the idea that the motivation is self-interest. That's what motivates people, what economics is about, the self-interest and so on. He spent a lot of time in explaining that this is not what people are just striving for. They are striving also for what he called the principle of sympathy. People want to be loved. They want to be accepted. The social fabric will not work if there's not also this sense of empathy, this sense of belonging to a community. And so he spent a lot of time by showing that when we look at the motivation in women, in men, women, and society, we have to take a much more complex attitude rather than just saying, oh, people just follow their self-interest. And if you're an economist, you have to be able to understand what are different motivations that allow the society to work, because there are other elements that are at work. So it is true that Smith is the founder of so-called liberal prospect in economics, but he has this idea, and that's what makes him, a liberal, that individual knows themselves what is better rather than somebody tell them, the state or the government and so on. So it is true, he's a liberal in this respect. But the interests are not just economic interests. Individuals have also the desire to be loved. They want it to be respected. There are various ways in which the society works on the basis of individualism. It's not just pursuing of economic interests. And so by reading Adam Smith, we have a sense that there is a way of doing economics in which we want to bring in these motivations, not just putting a student in front of a computer and making them, find the experimental exercise and decide everything. This is what is done nowadays. You have all these experiments, basically paying a student or somebody to go in front of the computer and answer questions and so on. If you want to, there is other ways. Another ways is try to understand what makes society, what are the motivations inside society, how the identity of society is formed, what are the values and so on. So maybe you can understand economics much better. The idea that the same economic model applied to the same, no matter what type of society, from Russia to India to China, the same model. Obviously, this doesn't work. You have to apply economics idea by knowing also the type of society you're dealing with. And I think this comes from Adam Smith. Adam Smith was the one who taught us, look, before doing any kind of economics, try to understand the kind of society you're dealing with. What are the motivation? What are the identity? What are the things that drives? I don't know what's happening here. It's not doing anything. Why is not? What happened? No notes? Okay. Forget it. We got it. We have a God overseeing us, you know. Oh my goodness, I'm really. Okay. So that's the premises. You know, Adam Smith taught us that if you want to understand economic behavior, you have to step back and look at human motivation. And to look at human motivation, you have to knowledge of what the society is like, what are the value, what are people driving attitudes. And this may vary from society, from class to another, and so on. But then, of course, he has what I call the proper economics. And he started what is a well-known fact, the division of labor. You know, the pin factory, the idea that, you know, if you is engaged in a specific task, then you increase productivity rather than having one person to do all the. This is something that I gather you've been told. And so then he started by division of labor, and then he asked himself the big question, which is the title of the book, The Wealth of Nations. You know, what makes a society being richer than another? And so he started by looking at the standard of living of the population. And he said, well, of course, the wealth of a society, wealth of a particular given system, it depends how many citizens are employed in productive labor being the one who's able to produce a profit. And of course, what is the constraint in the increase in the division of labor is the size of the market. You can have, you know, the pin factory, but if you don't have enough demand for pins, there's no point in increasing productivity. So there are two sides of the matter. You know, the size of the market is the drive force for productivity, and increasing productivity in terms expand the market because more people are engaged and so forth. So the wealth of a nation is obviously depends on the number of the population who are engaged in productive activity, and this average per capita depends according to into two factors. Is the share of productive factor in the population. And then, of course, it depends on the stage in which the division of labor has reached. And this depends in turn by the size of the market, and the size of the market depends by the consumer income. And this in turn depends how you make the economy market oriented. You see, it's funny for us because market now for us is considered to be, you know, a given factor. But at Adam Smith time, you know, make the society working on a market base was something that need to be enforced. Market is not a natural thing. It's not something that developed out of, you know, like a God-given law of nature. Market need to be created. And that's what Adam Smith fought. He said, if we want to have a rich society at his time, he was fighting against feudalism. He was fighting against the strength and the power of the church, of the king, of the feudals. And so having a market society was revolutionary because meant, you know, to do something. And that's what Smith liberalism is about. It's creating. Market is an institution. It's not something natural, you know. And I think the important, again, the lesson we should learn from Adam Smith, that market need to be created. And the way in which you create market makes a lot of difference. What happens with the liberalization, privatization in Russia after the fall of communism? It was not a market created thing. It was something that was, you know, imposed. What happens? We have another oligarchy. You know, people who benefit from privatization, they benefit from in a market economy, and the society did not become more liberal. Just a new type of oligarchy, rather than from the Communist Party, came from the wealth of people who. So you see, that's the lesson Adam Smith. When you create market, remember you're doing an institution thing. So the rules that you set up and how you transform a society into a market society, it depends much how you do it, what kind of powers you are mobilizing or not, okay? And so this is a very short sketch of the process by which, by the way, these slides will be available to all of you, so don't worry if you don't write everything or if you don't get everything, because of course I'm rushing over things, which is not good. But I want to give you a flavor of the context of these things. And so don't worry if you don't get everything, because you will have the slides. And of course, I will be available also to any question, also in the future, write to me, and I'll happy to email back to you, okay? So I apologize for rushing over things, but I had two choices. Either I do little, very detailed manner, or I do a lot in a very sketchy manner. I choose the second option because I wanted to give you as much as possible stimulus of things that you might want to read and to get into. If I just give you a small stuff, maybe this is not the one that they are interested in. In this case, I give you everything from Adam Smith to Keynes. There is a lot inside. So you might pick and choose the kind of topic that you might like both, okay? So that's we had the Adam Smith vision. And then we get to the second one before we do a break, which is Ricardo. Ricardo is one of my pet authors. I spent 10 years of my life on him. So I cannot be so sketchy as I would be with other, but I will have to. So I just give you a list of the most interesting works, the most important works. He had, unlike Smith was a philosopher, was interested in history and so on. Ricardo was a stockbroker. So he was an economist in the strict sense, and he was interested mainly in one question: how is the capital system going to work? How can we make the society more capitalist and try to fight the landowner, to find those classes of society who would prevent capital system to increase. That was his, he was very much admired by Marx for that. He said, you know, he had a genuine interest. He believed that the capitalist society, again, we're talking about capitalism against the background which the society was much backwards. So at the time, capitalism is not something as we would see it now. It was something that would increase, you know, it was interested in see how the system could become more productive, more effective, how, you know, if profit would increase, then would mean that more people would be employed, that there would be more progress in society. He might have been, you know, very much class-minded. I'm not denying this. But he was fighting against the landlords, against the clergy, against those aspects of society that didn't allow the system to exploit all this potentiality. And that's what's interesting about Ricardo, was very much, that was this so he was very much interested in the relationship between workers, capitalists, and landowners. And he was interested what determined the distribution of income among these classes, and the laws. That's what he said. You know, what I'm interested to discover the laws of distribution. What determines the rate of profit? What determines wages? What determines rent? And why are these income antagonists? And this is again something interesting. The idea that the size of the cake is given, and if you have a larger slice for the workers, then would mean that a smaller slice would go to capitalists and landowners. And he was fighting for the idea to give capitalists as much as profit as possible, because we assume that the capitalists would invest their profit. They were not spending it in luxury. The idea is that the capitalists were investing in the system, and by investing in the system, it will provide more progress for the society. Might have been so too much an idyllic vision, but we're talking about early 19th century, at the time in which capitalist system was still in its infancy. Okay. So how did he go about it? How did he go about the idea of discovering the law of distribution? That's what he wanted to discover. What are the laws of distribution? What makes profit go up and down, or rent go up and down, or wages go up and down? And so that's the way in which he argues, which is typical of the classical system. The idea is that, let's start from wages. He said, well, wages are determined at the level which is historically given. That's one has to be careful about this. When we say that in classical theory, wages, since we are so used to the supply and demand of labor in order to take wages, we find difficult to think in a different terms. His terms were, in a given society, what constitutes a basic wage is a datum. It changes over time. When I was a kid, having a TV set was something that only upper class did. Now, if, the wages of a worker in an industrialist country, it would not allow him to buy a TV set. It means that, because TV set is part of the basket of goods that we assume that any worker should get it. So the basket of goods that are considered to be part of the subsistence level do not mean just the food or clothes. It means whatever in a given society is considered to be an average wage that would allow people to live at the level, of course, in which they are. If you are a computer engineer, it's not like you are a factory worker. But the idea is that the level of wage is determined by a set of consumption goods that we can consider as given for a given society. So once you've done that particular assumption, then what is left over at the end of the production process is what he calls the surplus. So at the end of a productive process, you have an output. Once you take out the part which is considered to be the subsistence level, which is a datum, what is left is called the surplus. And the surplus is divided, of course, between profits and rent. And that's what he was interested in, to find out how large is going to be this surplus, and how is it distributed between profit and rent. And why was he interested in profit? Because he said, if we give too much to the landlord, they would spend in luxury, in mansions, in unproductive type of spending. And he was fighting from the idea that we should try to get as much as possible to the capitalist class, because these are the class that will invest in the productive process, and therefore the class will be leading the capitalist process. So what do we take out from this? The most important lesson. Distribution, nothing to do with supply and demand of factors. Distribution has to do with a society which is divided into classes. Of course, here is simplified, 3 classes, but let's take the idea is that there is a class whose consumption, whose level of remuneration is fixed by factors which are not economical most of the time. They are socially given. Okay, what is the level? And what is left over is a struggle between different parts of society. And so there is no, who can believe this, that wages are determined by supply and demand? This is the Mickey Mouse story, look at society around you, and if you take the classical approach, you have a much more sensible way of looking at the distribution than with the neoclassical theory. Okay. And now, before we get to Marx, I think we take a pause. Okay, because Marx requires to be, fully relaxed and ready to. Okay. Okay. So I don't know how long is the break. Usually 10 minutes or so. Let's God comes and tell us. He's not coming. He's taking a break himself. Okay, so let's do 10 minutes. God has said 10 minutes? 15. Wow. But
so they can go out and come in.
Okay.
Get to the regular student, please help to get to have a cup of chai, coffee. Okay, and 15 minutes.
But you want to finish at 5 sharp or 5:15, I think, because we start at 15. No, okay. Is that okay if we finish 5:15? Because we started 15 later.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay.
Can you also open the door?
Somebody else is I'm just waiting a couple of other people. Okay. Everybody's in? Okay, sir. Okay, thank you. So now we get to the man with the beard. I wanted to show you that Marx is really a classical economist. So when we say we want to recuperate the classical approach, I think we want to get Kene, this idea of the interrelationship of the system with classes, not of course for the agriculture, but from the first input-output analysis that shows you how input and output are related to the social classes of the society. Then we want to have Adam Smith because of the sense of human behavior and again the representation of the system in which the relationship between market and productivity is particularly tight, and the idea that market are institutions, okay, that need to be created, and the way in which market function depend on the institutional setting in which they are embedded. And then we have Ricardo, and particularly Ricardo is important for the law of distribution and to understand how the surplus is divided between profit and rent, and how wages are determined at the subsistence level, meaning by subsistence, what is socially determined in a given time by a given society, okay? Now we get to Marx. Well, Marx differed from Ricardo Smith because obviously he was living at the time in which the devils or the evils of capitalism were known. And so he was fighting the opposite cause by showing that capitalism had inside the germ of his destruction, that there were other better systems that could develop. But the way in which he argued, the way in which he saw the working of the system is very much embedded in the classical tradition. And in fact, he was a great admirer of Ricardo. He said, you know, Ricardo is a defender, but he was a classical economist, not a vulgar economist. Somebody who was just defending capitalism. He wanted to understand capitalism because he believed that he could be doing. Marx obviously was not just an economist. He was a great philosopher. He was a political activist. He was so many other things. And for me, it's very difficult to put everything in 15 minutes or whatever, half an hour, but I'll try, okay? So we want to start again with a list of most important work by him, economic philosophy manuscript, and so on. The only volume of Capital that he actually published was volume 1. The other two, volume 2 and volume 3, were put together by Engels. And the Grundrisse were also published posthumously. The other one were instead published in his lifetime. No, that's to say that there is again a matter of interpretation. There is all literature now in Marxism to what really Marx meant and whether, you know, his idea is more important, what it is in the Grundrisse, what is more important in Capital. There is, you know, a huge amount of literature on this interpretation and so forth. So we can't get into this, but just to let you know that, you know, if you're serious about Marx, there is a lot of secondary literature to go through, and not to mention the labor theory of value, you know, like a war has been fought by defenders and those who say, no, the labor theory doesn't work. So, I mean, again, this is an exercise in the history of economic thought, you know, interpretation, evidence, also your own political views would influence what you think is more important and so on. But let's be reminded why Marx is important and what are the concepts that have been lost and we would like to have them back in the agenda. The first is concept of alienation. You know, concept of alienation is the idea that workers are estranged from the product of their labor. The second important concept is fetishism, that social relationship appears as relationship among commodities, among things. And then there is obviously the first and most important concept is the concept of exploitation. There is an inner asymmetry of power in the production system between capitalists and workers. And I mean, so the idea is that exploitation is done as if it was done through the market relationship. You don't see it, but it's there. You don't see it because of the fetishism, because it seems to be the way in which the system works is through markets, through, commodity exchange. You don't see it, but that is there. And you don't see it because it is obscured. The power relationship is obscure in the market relationship, as if, the laborer is selling freely is labor force, is not forced like in the feudal system, is free, but is free to be exploited in the end. Now, that's the message that we get. How did Marx get to this concept, and what is the philosophy behind it, which is important? And this is important because we will get back to this concept later in the course when we talk about Sraffa and the idea, the philosophical outlook is called historical materialism. What historical materialism? I think that the best way of describing is to give the definition that Marx himself gave when he said, in the social production which men carry on, mainly production activity, they enter into definite relationships that are indispensable and independent of their will. This relationship of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material powers of production. And so he envisaged this famous concept of the structure and the superstructure. The relationship of production are the economic structure of society, upon which, he said, the legal, political superstructure, the theory, the ideology develop. But if you want to understand a society, if you want to understand what's going on, you have to start from the material relation of production. And that's why it's called materialism. You don't start from ideas, you start from the material production. And that's where you get the sense of what the society is like, okay? So he said, when you understand this, and you look at the social relationship, then you look at the material life, which is what matters if you want to understand the ideology, the political, the legal structure. And the spiritual process of life, the intellectual process of life, is rooted in the material life. So it's not the other way around. It's not that idea dominate the material life or the other thing. And that is the famous sentence. It is not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but on the contrary, the social existence determines their consciousness. This is famous. And then here is the the famous prediction, which unfortunately didn't become true, but that was his prediction. At a certain stage of their development, the material forces of production of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, okay? So material forces are the structure of production. The social forces are how these material forces of production are embedded in the social relationship, worker, capitalist. The way you take any production process, then you look at what are the social forces embedded in that particular production. And so he said there is a point when these productive forces are very, very well developed, saying the total factory or the world is turned into the big factory, just to say, then the relationship of production are not corresponded to that reality. And so they become contradictory. And that's where a new system develops, when there is a conflict between the forces of production, the nature of production, and the type of social. So if you are a system in which, say, 99% are workers and only 2% are capitalists, there might be a situation in which the power relationship would change by the very nature of the situation. This is a very simple example. Keynes, obviously, Marx is making things much more refined and so on. But that's contradiction between the nature of the productive system and the type of social relationship that are embedded in that production system. They might not correspond to a point. And that's where the capitalist system may collapse. And because the socialization of labor has reached a point in which socialism appears to be more appropriate than capitalist system. That's, I'm making very simple. Obviously, it's not that simple. So we want now to look at the classical economists as a whole and give you a sense of what is relevant about them. I think the most important notion that we get from the classical system, and we will use it as a way to show the difference with neoclassical system, is the notion of surplus, okay? And the representation of the system as a circular flow of production and consumption. Okay, I want you to keep in mind these two concepts. Okay, what is the surplus? What remains after wages are paid? And wages are determined independently, okay? They are dependent by the social structure of the society, okay? And remember Keynes, and the idea that the economic system, the production is a circular flow of production and consumption, as Adam Smith. It's not linear from input to output, like in the neoclassical system. It's the idea that there is a circular production, like in the agriculture, no? You get input, and then in order for the system to be reproducible, you have to have this first surplus going back into the production and to have the system to start again, okay? So what is the nature of the classical system that we want to keep it in mind in order to distinguish it from what we will call it the neoclassical system? Is the independent determination of prices and distribution. Distribution is determined by social forces. Prices are determined in other ways, and we will see how, but the idea is they are independently determined. In neoclassical system, they are simultaneously determined, you know? Well, because distribution is just one way of factor pricing. You know, there's no difference than the price of sugar and the wages. They're the same law, supply and demand. So prices and distribution are determined by the same laws, supply and demand. Factor prices, or in the classical system, distribution is socially determined. And it's nothing to do with the price determination. There is a separation of the laws that determine one set to another. Third, society is not described as individuals, Homo economicus or some other Mickey Mouse sort of representation. Society is divided into classes. We might dispute how many classes. We might say, well, the classical or simplifying method, because now we have we don't have such a sharp distinction between type of workers, type of, capitalist and so on. But the idea is that there is a difference between being a worker and being a capitalist. The idea is that ownership of means of production, power, strategy, however you choose to define a class, the idea is that's not individual that matters when you want to understand the working, but you have to introduce the concept of class. without which we don't get much. Then there is the idea that production should be at the center, not like in neoclassical economics, in which everything is doing through exchange. You don't get much production in neoclassical. Yes, you have a production function. Epsilon equal F decay and L. That's the kind of production you get. You don't have. Well, in the classical system, there's a lot of, especially Marx, but not just in Marx, there's a lot of attention of production. And what is more important, you don't get the balance in equilibrium as a result of the forces of demand and supply. Mind you, it's not that the classical economists ignore demand and supply. They didn't have it as a function. Something smoothly, and we will see the criticism why this supply and demand function should not be trusted very much. The classical author, of course, thought that there was supply and demand, but they thought of them as a point rather than a schedule, because the schedule implied that you can move up and down, that as a virtual exercise. What would the price be? What would the quantity be if the price be that and that one? You're making all this virtual exercise along a demand curve, okay? And you bring the demand curve, the supply curve to determine equilibrium, but you need the shape of that curve. Otherwise, you cannot converge to equilibrium. Otherwise, you have the cobweb effect. You know, if the curve are inverted, you don't get it there. You just move out. So you need to have that particular type of schedule. And the classical authors don't have that notion of equilibrium. They have a different notion, as we will see. And they are interested much more in the structure of the system rather than on behavioral issues. I need the other set. Who's the guy who's helping me? You are the guy? Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is the last set for today's lecture. Okay, so I told you that what really matters in order to define a classical system as opposed of neoclassical system, and that's why people like myself or people who have followed the tradition, Marxist, classical, and so on, they want to oppose the neoclassical theory by saying, let's follow a different route to the determination of prices and distribution. Of course, we cannot use the same theory. We cannot use Ricardo as if, you know, we're talking about 1820 England, you know, but the idea that the distribution is not determined by supply and demand, is determined by the way in which surplus is divided within a given society among those who are not workers, who are not paid labor. That's kind of idea is much more helpful to understand what's going on. And that's what we want to develop. So when we say we use history of economic thought to pick up idea that we can develop as an alternative to neoclassical economics, this is an example. I'm not saying we reproducing the same theory would be stupid, you know, that I say today to explain distribution in India, what's going on with income distribution, I have to take Ricardo's theory. That would be ridiculous. Nobody. But I would take an approach in which the basic elements are not supply and demand, but are class distribution, they are the surplus, they are all these elements that we have to reward and to rework into modern times. Not the same, but the approach is based on conceptually different things than the one that you find in your classic. That's the whole idea, okay? All right. So let's concentrate on these key differences between classic and neoclassical economic theory. Okay. Prices. Okay. Remember, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, they all have prices of production, what they call it, okay, which they distinguish from market prices. You said they had the idea they are normal prices, which are average, and they are market prices that are sort of daily fluctuation. They were interested in the long-term forces. The idea what determines the normal average prices of a given commodity. And they understood that market prices may differ on a daily basis, but they were not interested on the daily, instant determination of prices. They wanted to know, is there a law that explains what production prices, what prices are determined in the long period? That was the main questions, the theoretical question that were. So the first take-home things that we have to remember, forget about supply and demand. Curve, functions, not supply and demand as points. Of course, nobody would deny that supply and demand matters, but they are not conceived as functions. Second take-home, the division of the social product between wages and profit is determined by economic and social forces, are not determined by supply and demand of factors. Wages is not determined by the supply of labor and demand for labor. Profit is not the remuneration. If you think of it, who in his mind would think that the profit are the supply and demand of capital? And I mean, this is just a way in which you can camouflage the reality in which the society we live in. The capitalist system is ruled by very different methods than just supply and demand of capital. And then also the problem of what is capital is also problematic, as we will see. So the take-home thing, the second take-home thing, that we have to think a distribution as mainly based on these broad economic and social forces that allows you to determine the surplus and wages, but of different principles than factor remuneration. It's not factor remuneration that would... and the notion of the social surplus is the core of the analysis, okay? So we will get back many times to this idea of the social surplus as something that... So how is this social surplus determined in the classical system? That for us is important because this surplus explains distribution, okay? So in order to determine the surplus, for the Kene, it was easier because it was thinking all agriculture. So we're thinking that input and output were made of the same commodity. So it was very easy to see the surplus. You invest 1 ton of corn, and then in the end you get 2 tons of corn. So when you pay the wages in corn, the surplus is very easy to be determined because it's in physical terms. Obviously, when you want to talk about the social surplus with so many commodities, and then you have to aggregate them in prices. But how can you do it in prices if you don't know the profit and wages? So it's become circular unless you find a solution. And that's what we are trying to get, okay? So in order to determine the surplus in a society in which you have multiple factors, you have to know a few things. The real wage, okay? The real wage, meaning the quantities of the several commodities that are part of the real wage. Remember that I told that this set of commodity is socially determined. If you take the basket of commodity that is assumed, nowadays we assume is part of the standard wage of a common worker, you will have a list of things that you would not find 20 years ago. It's like when you measure inflation, the basket that you use, it depends very much in the circumstances. You cannot use the basket to measure inflation today that you would have used 20 years ago. Same with the wage. You know, so the classical author thought that there was a standard of living that had to be guaranteed in any wage. And I think today is the same. You know, you have a level of wages, standard wages, that allow you to buy a certain set of things that now are considered basic commodities, not luxury commodities. I gave you the example of the TV set. You know, in the 1950s, people who had the TV set were the upper classes. Now, I think that, you know, we'll take the smartphone, okay, just to give an easier example. You know, it would be unthinkable that in the basic wages of a basic worker, he would not be allowed to buy a smartphone, you know, because this is becoming part of the standard consumption. Okay? Then the second thing we have to know is the social product. So in order to determine the surplus, we have to know the wages, but we have to know the aggregate set of commodities produced in the year. And then we have to know the technical condition of production, because that would allow us to find the level of employment in the system. So by multiplying the number of laborers that we determine on the basis of the technical production by the physical wage, we obtain what Ricardo called the necessary consumption. And so we get the surplus as social production, the aggregate of all commodities produced in a given year, minus the necessary consumption, and we got the surplus, which is shares other than wages. Okay? This seems to be very neat, but there is a problem that we cannot do it in physical terms. Okay? Conceptually is very interesting, but how can we do it if we don't aggregate everything in prices? And that's where the classical had a problem. And that's thanks to Sraffa. We know now how to solve this problem, but conceptually, the idea remained the same. Once you solve the problem of aggregation and prices, the idea, what I want you to think is the idea that distribution is determined by taking out wages determined in a way and then dealing with the surplus, not determine simultaneously wages, profit as factor price determination. Is that clear? Is that you can see is a completely different way of looking at distribution with the problem that I just mentioned. So I'm not saying that we can take it as it is in Ricardo, because he was unable to solve it. Even Marx, he tried with the transformation problem to solve it, but he didn't manage to. So that's something that neoclassical authors have always criticized. Those like us who follow the classical say, well, I mean, what does it mean that you have a datum, that wages are a datum? So, I mean, we want to know what determines wages. And the answer is not that we don't want to determine wages. It's just we take them as given in that particular exercise. And we take them as given because we assume that the level of wages is determined by social forces that can be very different. The point is that we take it wage as a datum in order to be able to determine the surplus. Not because we think that it's a given that needs not to be explored or analyzed, but it needs to be explored and analyzed with different methods than supply and demand. As already told you, the subsistence need not to be interpreted as, you know, basic subsistence, but by historical and social circumstances. So the idea, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but it's very important, what the classical author wanted us to think, and I believe they were right, that the conditions that determine wages are different in nature of the condition that determine profit and rents, so financial rents and so on. They're different and they should be studied separately. There should not considered to be determined by the same forces. Remember, in neoclassical theory, supply and demand of labor, supply and demand of capital, supply and demand of land determines the distributive shares. It's the same law. And this is the same law as the determination of prices. But remaining at the level of distribution is the same. And that's what the classical author said. No, the wages are determined by different laws. And profit and the surplus is what is left to be distributed by the non-worker. Something is wrong again. I don't know why. I'm sorry to bother you all the time, but show me what you do so I can do it. Is this is this one that makes a problem? Okay, so I'll go ahead now. This one? I'm sorry to bother you all the time. Okay, sorry. Okay, so let's get now to prices. Okay, I'll give you a sense of the story of the distribution. Let's get to For the classical author, it was very important in discussing prices that you make a difference. I already mentioned this. To make a difference from prices that are somehow priced towards which market price tend to gravitate in a certain period of time. So they were not so much interested to interpret the daily by daily, but they wanted to find a law that explained the determination of prices as an average, as something that tend to remain persistent, the persistence of prices, okay? And the typical example that Adam Smith gave, which is very famous, suppose that the king dies. Everybody has to wear, in the Western world, when somebody dies, you wear black. I understand that here you wear white, right? Like in China. Okay, forget it. Let's make it white. Okay? Everybody has to dress in white. So what happens? The seller of the clothes that sell white gets a lot of profit. Okay? But then all the other sellers realize that this guy is making money, so they will start to dye their own clothes. And so in the end, the price of clothes will be average because the first guy will get an extra profit, and by getting extra profit will attract capital in there. And that in the end, the quantity of white clothes would increase and their price would go down. Okay? So they have a mechanism. Sorry, you want to? Yes, demand and supply, but not as function. They're not. The idea is, as I mentioned to you, they obviously knew about demand and supply, but they say the quantity of white clothes has increased. The quantity is not the supply curve. The quantity of, and that quantity, of course, in the end will deprive prices. Okay, because that something, but the mechanism by which this works is the movement of capital from one sector to another. So everybody now is producing white clothes, and then will depress prices, the market prices. But in the end, what we have discovered, that the price of clothes in the long run we will determine by only one law, the equalization of the rate of profit. You know, so you cannot be the one who getting more than the other because all the other will get in your sector. And then, so what would determine the price of clothes is the equalization of the rate of profit. So that's the way in which they work. And so the idea is that the market price tend to gravitate towards what are the normal price, and the normal price are the rule. And demand and supply may determine market prices, but they will not determine the, and demand, as I said, is a point. As Smith said, is the demand of those who are willing to pay the natural price of the commodity. So what determines natural price is the rule of the equalization of the profit rate. Market price may be above or below the natural prices. So the natural price is the one who produce the equalization of the rate of profit by movement of capital from one sector to another. If you are a capitalist, you don't care whether you produce clothes or you produce wine or you produce anything. What you're interested is in a given rate of profit. And since capital move freely from subject to the other, this rule will explain. And then I have a piece in which it tells the story. When the quantity of any commodity which is brought to the market falls short of the effectual demand, all those who are willing to pay the whole volume of rent, wages, and profit, which must be paid in order to bring in thither, cannot be supplied with the quantity they want. Rather than want it altogether, some of them will be willing to give more. A competition will immediately begin among them, and the market price will rise more or less above the natural price, according either to the greatness or the efficiency, the wealth, or the luxury, and that will attract competition and so forth. So he explained very clearly the mechanism. And then I don't read the story is the opposite. You know, when the quantity is below, a certain quantity is above. So let me get to what is relevant for today's understanding of the situation. The classical theory gives us a way to approach matter in two distinct logical stages. There is what has been called the core, something which is isolated from the rest of the analysis, and is something that we look once we know the three determinants that I have already mentioned: wages, the social product, and the technical condition of production. Once you have these three things, you are able to get into the core, and the core will give you a way to understand the price determination. In the core, the surplus is relevant and is important, because once you know the surplus, you will be able to know the profit, and when you're able to know the profit, you're able to have the determination of prices. Remember, you cannot know prices unless you know the rate of profit, because obviously in the capital system, prices need to pay the rate of profit, and you cannot know prices unless you know the rate of profit, and you don't know the rate of profit unless you know prices. Okay, so that's so the way in which you work is that you understand the system as being having these three data: technical condition of production, social purpose, and wage determination. And then when you have that, you have the profit, and then you can start thinking about prices. All right? The classical authors were unable to do so for the reason that I will give you in a minute. But that's the approach. And the approach remained the same. It's just that you need to solve the problem. In neoclassical theory, you don't have that approach. The determination of wages is symmetrical with determination of other factors, and everything is determined simultaneously. Things generate equilibrium. Everything is determined. The price of peanuts and the price of the atomic bomb, they're all determined simultaneously with all the wages, all the profits, and so on. It's a completely simultaneous determination with one single rule: supply and demand. There's no other rule. Profit maximization on the one hand, utility maximization on the other. That gets you the supply and demand curve, and that everything is neatly presented. Like you can see, it's a completely different way to look at matter. The problem with the classical approach, of course, is that everything would be fine if we were dealing with physical aggregate, but you know, outside agriculture, outside the one sector economy, you're not dealing with physical. You have to aggregate them. To aggregate them, you have to do it in prices. If to do it in price, you have to know the rate, blah, 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 blah. There is this circularity. That how can you overcome this circularity in order to make the classical system useful? for today's analysis. How can you go from physical aggregates to value magnitude, avoiding the circularity? That in order to know prices, you have to know the rate of profit. In order to know the rate of profit, you have to know prices. How do you get out of this circularity in order for this approach to be useful? Smith tried. He said, well, the natural price is the sum of wages and profit. And he thought that you could use as a unit to measure these prices. You can use the labor commanded, while this doesn't overcome the difficulty because you have to know anyway the rate of profit in order to do so. So that's not the solution. Ricardo tried as well, like Marx. He said, okay, let's look at not the labor commanded, but the labor embodied. And so he said, well, if we measure everything in labor embodied, we translate everything in labor, then we can determine the rate of profit as the ratio between the two. But this is, of course, doesn't work because commodity do not exchange on the basis of quantity embodied. Classical example, if you have a wine in a bottle for 2 years, it will, even if the same amount of labor goes into producing that liter of wine, but of course, if it has to stay 2 years, the rate of profit needs to be different. And the prices of a bottle of wine that has to stay 2 years cannot be the same as the bottle of wine that stays 1 year. So labor doesn't solve the problem. And so we have to go to Sraffa. This is going to be very sketchy, I'm afraid. We cannot get into Sraffa, but I just want to suggest to you that there is a solution, and the solution is in this approach taken by Sraffa in his book in 1960, and who he worked with this, and he was able to determine simultaneously prices and distribution by assuming wage rate as a given, and by having a system of equation that allows to determine prices and distribution. What he showed that there is a unique set of exchange values, which, if they are adopted by the market, they were able to make the system reproduce itself in a way that solved the classical problem. So this is very sketchy. I'm very sorry to give it so abruptly, but I want to have some time for questions. But just to tell you that this classical approach has a solution. And so and by Sraffa working on the classical approach, is able to give us a theory of prices that is not based on demand and supply, is able to give us a theory of distribution, which is based on the notion of surplus. And this is a great news because it means that we have a way to go ahead with a kind of theory that is not bogged down in neoclassical terms. I'm sorry, it's going to be very quick, but I just wanted to make you know that the solution exists and has been found. Okay? So I think we have 10 minutes or even more if you want to questions. We said that we finish at 5:15. I'm happy to go more than that if needed, but I think that you had enough. And I stuff you with so many things that you need time to digest them, but let's try to a few questions also from online, if there are any. No, I completely killed them. They're not. Yeah, okay.
Ma'am, since you just rushed past the last few slides, can you clarify again what was the problem with Ricardo's answer to the question?
Well, Ricardo problem is that he thought that one way to solve the problem of circularity, assuming that you want to find the surplus, okay? So you have the social product, and then you have the social consumption, meaning productive labor, and then the surplus. Okay, it's a nice equation. The problem is you have to translate everything in value term. You cannot do in value term because there is the circularity. So Ricardo said, well, let's measure everything in labor embodied. Okay, so everything, let's translate. The problem is that labor embodied as such does not solve the problem that commodity may exchange at values that are more or less the labor embodied, because of maybe that, just to give you an example, time necessary. I give you the wine case. So if commodity would exchange exactly at their labor embodied value, then that could be done. But that's what exactly Marx was trying to do when he wanted to do the transportation of prices and so on. And that cannot be done. You need to find another ways. And this ways is, you find it in Sraffa, the way in which you don't have labor, you just have commodities as input and output. And then you find the exchange ratio that would allow the system to produce a standardized rate of profit and to make the system able to reproduce itself. So it's taking Kene back in a way. If forget about the labor theory review, that's why Marxists are not very happy with Sraffa, because Sraffa said labor theory value is not working. But Marx approached the matter, if we take it with a different route, it's still valid because it's part of the classical approach. Oh, you want to finish off? Let's him finish. Do you have a supplement question?
Yeah, I mean, this is the same problem that Marx is trying to address with the transformation problem.
Yeah, exactly. No, Marx wanted to address the problem of transformation because he wanted to start from values, he wanted to get to production processes. And so he wanted to solve the problem. How did you get from values? Values are for labor, remember? And now he wants to have a prices of production. Yeah.
So, I mean, can you explain why do you think the Marx's analysis of the transformation problem is dissatisfactory?
Well, because he doesn't get the same. He start from the surplus, the way in which he reckon the surplus, and then it is distributed. You don't get out of that circulation thing, because it's like with the labor. You have to know things in order to be able to. In order to be able to determine prices of production, you have to know the rate of profit, and the rate of profit needs that you measure surplus over the value of capital. But how did you measure the value of capital if you don't have prices? Problem is always the same. If you could work with physical terms, that would be fine. Or if commodity would exchange at their labor content, as Marx assumed in volume first of capital, there's no problem because you don't have heterogeneity. But when you have heterogeneity, you have to measure everything in prices. And if you have to measure everything in prices, you need to know the rate of profit. In order to need the rate of profit, you have to measure capital in value terms, in prices.
Some sense a continuation of the same question. I think many of the times the critique to labor theory of value that is presented by both neoclassicals and people within the classical framework but not happy with the labor theory of value is that there's some logical inconsistency within it. It is as if, given those assumptions in the frame, the classical economists using labor theory of value were not satisfactorily answering the question of prices. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the assumptions that classicals do make is that every period the production starts anew, right? So you have total output. The total output is distributed into wages and the surplus. Wages are totally consumed, surplus is reinvested, and then you start afresh from the next period, but maybe with a higher stock of capital or whatever, given the level of surplus that you actually achieve. So the question of time that Sraffa sort of brings in order to say that the labor relative labor quantities do not necessarily match with relative prices will not exist if, technically should not exist if you end your analysis in one period and then you start anew, right? In the next period.
Well, the thing is that you see, but you want to find the way in which the system reproduces itself. So the basic question is that you don't want to know what happens at the end. You want to know under which conditions the prices must be such that the system is able to reproduce itself. So it's part of the question that you want to answer. What makes this, because it's not linear like the neoclassic, you don't start from the period. So Sraffa doesn't, he said that the labor theory of value would be valuable. He's not criticizing the labor theory of value as such. By the way, I think that the importance of the labor theory of value is not as much in the price determination. It's more important from alienation, from fetishism, for all these things. So I think that we should not throw the baby with the in the bathroom. But I think that what Sraffa is telling us, you don't need a labor theory of value. If you have the list of physically determined commodities as the input, you have the list of...
I'll suggest you should be taxed. Even it will be a team that would go there. Okay. Yes.
What's happening? Huh? Oh, somebody is talking. So you see, the thing is that the question we want to ask, what the price must be in order for the system to be viable, and meaning able to reproduce itself, either as an enlarged or the same scale. So that's the question you're asking. You're asking basically, and if you do this one thing or the other, well, you're not answering that question. You might answer another question, but not the question that Sraffa was interested and the classical was interested, because remember, they wanted to know what makes the system work. So it's not just the price, as such. You want to find the price that would allow the capital system to reproduce itself and to grow.
I'll just stop with this. But in Marx, for example, while using the labor theory of value, using labor as the quantity, the standard for measurement, he is still able to have the schemas, right? The scheme for simple reproduction, the scheme for expanded reproduction.
In value terms.
Yeah, in value terms, in labor value terms.
In labor
value terms. So my my point is from this, that when Marx is able to sort of explain the system over time, in the sense you have an expanded reproduction system scheme, which is all in labor values and can explain you how the system is growing over time. Sraffa's critique of the labor theory of value, that it does not take time into account in order to explain relative prices.
You don't need it. You don't need it. You bring unnecessary problems. Sraffa doesn't write anything about it. So we deduce it from what he does. He said, the labor theory of value creates a problem because commodities do not exchange at the labor context. They do not. The labor theory of value is useful because it allows you to see, to determine and so on. But we have to start, and that's what Marx was worried, because he knew that commodities do not exchange at their value. That's why he wanted to transform into prices. Why was he not happy to stay capital one? Because he knew, as a matter of fact, he started writing the opposite. He started writing capital volume 3 and then went back forward. So for him, the labor theory of value was a way to go beyond the appearance, to see what was behind the capital system, but that he knew that he had to confront the idea that he had to explain prices, how prices are determined. And so when he got to the idea to explain the working of the capital system, he was left with the question, what about prices in society, how they are determined? And that's if he was facing the same problem as Ricardo and as the other. Because he had to go back to prices. Had he been able to remain in the value, that would be perfect. And as a matter of fact, I think that Marx is very valuable, because through the labor theory of value, it gives us a lot of insights of the working of the capital system. But certainly we cannot say that commodities change their values, and Haney knows that, and so he had to face the problem. Okay, so okay, who's same guy or another guy? Hello? Yes, I'm ready to listen what he has to say. Please go ahead. It's been muted, I think.
Yeah.
So you want to make a comment or you want to make a question?
No, I want to ask a question.
Question, good.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that. Why do we necessarily need to quantify the value and price and all this? Like in Marxist framework, Marx was talking about we should plan how to manage the economy. If it is not planned economy, how then we can quantify the value to measure how it is distributed and all. But why in a planned economy where we can decide for whom to produce, how to produce, and what to produce? That is basically my question.
I'm sorry, I don't know whether it's a matter of sound or did any of you understand the question?
Yeah, I was
slowly. Now let me ask here the students where they understand the question, because it's me with the sound or whether it's the question is, what is the question?
Saying in the planned economy, the prices and everything can be determined, how much is being produced, how much is being produced. So why do we need to bother with this transformation into prices in the first?
Well, we bothered because Marx bothered, because he wanted to explain the determination of prices in a capital system. He wanted to describe how the capital system worked. And so he wanted to explain how prices are determined. In a planned economy, I don't think he got into this. It was later people like Lange, other people were interested in the question. But Marx himself wanted to explain how prices are determined in a capitalist system. Okay, yes, you have another question. Is that you? No. Oh, you just helped me with this question. Okay, thank you. All right. Anyone else? If none, then I thank you very much for your attention. It's been a fantastic class. Everybody's happy, everybody's smiling. So hopefully enjoy this. If you don't, I'll try to do my best tomorrow. Okay, bye. Have a nice evening.